Today we're going to talk about stand development. I learned about stand development, about a month ago, actually, poking around on the internet, and I was immediately intrigued. Before we talk specifically about what stand development is, if you're not familiar with the normal practice of developing film, it can be fairly complicated. Number one, you need to know the manufacturer of the film. Number two, the brand. Three, there are a number of variables that you have to deal with. One is the amount of time that you're going to spend developing the film in the solution. And number two, you need to know what the solution is. The solution has two parts: the developer itself and water. They have a specific ratio, which is dependent upon, in part, the effect that you want to achieve, but dependent also on the film and on the developer itself. So, for example, one of the more common developers is HC110, used by Ansel Adams. So it's been around a long time, available from Kodak. We switched about a month and a half ago to Neofin Blue. If I were to develop Kodak Tri-X in HC110 versus Neofin Blue, my ratio of developer to water would be completely different, to be expected. So you have two alternatives. Figure it out for yourself, or find someone else's formula. There are plenty of places where you can find formulas if you are specifically using a common developer like HC110. But if you use Neofin Blue, you're pretty much out there by yourself. Secondly, it's also important to keep in mind that the formulas typically are rated in concentration from A through H, where H uses the least amount of developer, A the most. So if you use A, it is the least amount of time. If you use H, it is the most amount of time. Again, what you'll find in the world of film is that there's a tremendous amount of debate. For my taste, and again, a lot of this comes down to what you want, I prefer the least amount of chemical, the longest amount of time, because I'm going to get more contrast and more detail. And that is a very important part of the emotional experience for me. Number two, one of the problems with film, let's clear this away, that you're going to run into if you come from the digital world, you know that you can change the ISO at will. That does not work well in film. There are exceptions to the rule. For example, Ilford HP5. You can actually mix ISOs on a roll, and we've done it. This film is rated at 400 ISO, or at least the version we were using. We shot and have shot several rolls at ISO 200, and in one experiment we tried 200, 400, and 800 on the same roll. Keep in mind another variable. Technically, if I were to take an ISO 400 film and shoot it at ISO 200, this is called pulling. I can't use the same formula that I would use for ISO 400. Raising the ISO is called pushing. And again, I can't use the same formula that I used or should use when the film was developed at ISO 400. So if I can't change the ISO at will, there are going to be real life situations. I had one a week ago. Where there is very little I can do. By the way, I'm using a Pentax 6x7 camera, which uses 120 millimeter film. My camera was made sometime around 1980. And my fastest lens is 2.4. Most of my lenses are somewhere around 4 to 5.6. If you haven't seen a 6x7, it's a huge camera, and the lenses are huge. So compared to a DSLR, it's going to let a lot more light into the lens. However, if you're going to photograph a model in the shadows, you're going to have an issue with the ISO. So at the time, I was using Kodak T-Max 100 ISO, which I really like. And my most effective option would have been to go to ISO 200 or 400, because otherwise I was going to have to shoot at a 30th of a second. You're not going to get a model to sit still. You're not going to get any human to sit still at a 30th of a second. And it's very difficult to hold the camera still. So it would have been nice if on that roll with that model, I would have been able to raise my ISO and still develop the film without losing any images or coming up with terrible grain or otherwise being frustrated with the results. So this takes me to stand development. The principles behind stand development are really very simple. They are, over time, in other words, if you wait long enough, as in 1 hour, eventually the developer is exhausted. It simply becomes ineffective. So if you were to leave the film in 2 hours, 3 hours, 2 days, after a certain point it won't matter. The chemical HC110 neofilm blue will simply stop working. Number two, the basic idea that it's predicated upon is it's kind of an agnostic. It just flat out doesn't care. So any film, any ISO, or mixed ISOs, and it doesn't matter. The principle is the same. Leave it for at least an hour, agitate it, More about that in a second. At the end, finish the way you would with stop and fixer. So let's look more closely at point number one. One of the fundamental differences between stand development and typical development is you use very little developer. For HC110, people were using about 5 milliliters to about 500 milliliters of water. For neofin blue, again, because there was no information and even contacting the manufacturer didn't help, I used 10 milliliters to 480 milliliters of water. Keep in mind, by the way, that I use a lab box, not a Patterson tank. A lab box allows me to not be in a dark room or not crowd myself into one of those airtight bags or light tight bags where you're basically blind when you load the film. It only holds 495 milliliters of water, of fluid. So actually I went to 185. That filled my lab box perfectly. Number two, most of the time, agitation is done twice, and usually not more than 15 seconds. Now, there's a problem with that. I learned, doing some research, that agitation is really very important because the chemical tends to, or the chemical bath, become ineffective unless you move it around. In a Patterson tank, this means shaking it and rotating it, tapping it to get the air bubbles out. In a lab box, there are no air bubbles. You just turn the crank and you're good to go. If you don't agitate sufficiently, and by the way, this is one of the knocks on stand development, is that the images are often soft and lack contrast. So I modified it, and this takes us to this point, where I rotated or agitated the first minute and then 15 seconds every minute thereafter. And as you'll see momentarily, the images are really nice. So why use stand development? If you're in a situation where you absolutely have to, vary the ISO on a single roll. If you're using a film or a developer and you're not sure what the numbers should be to properly develop the film and you don't want to, quote, waste a roll, unquote, then stand development is a very real option. I'll warn you that sitting there for an hour, rotating every 15 seconds in every minute can drive you absolutely batty. Fortunately, I had my Android tablet and an old movie on Turner Classic Movies going, and it wasn't that bad. Am I going to use it all the time? No, I'm not. I'm going to stick with neofin blue the way that we've calibrated it most of the time. But if I'm out, for example, photographing nature, and I find myself photographing a waterfall in a particularly dark area, I will be able to change my ISO, and I will use stand development. So let's take a look at a couple of images now. and then we'll end this version of Let's Talk. These are from a place called Bethania near Winston-Salem, North Carolina. This film was HP5 plus ISO 400. All of these images were shot at ISO 200. By the way, stand development is considerably better for slower films. So let's take a closer look. HP5 can be extremely grainy, and you can see here there is no extraordinarily pronounced grain. I even have the shadow of the power line on the grass, which in post-processing I might eventually remove. Detail in the clouds is really good. I tend to use a yellow filter. All around, I'm very pleased. Another one from Bethania. Remember, I'm using a camera from 1980 and the light meter is extremely primitive. But notice I even got the building behind this little building. The texture all the way around is really quite good. Again, ISO 200 and ISO 400 film. Because I agitated more frequently, stand development worked really well. We're going to be doing a follow-up article, by the way, about stand developing in the August 2022 edition of Night Vision magazine. You'll be able to find that here. If you don't read it at that point, you'll be able to go to the archives for 2022, select issue number 3, and you'll be able to read the article. Our contact information follows. I want to thank you for joining me. My name is Falcon. I'm the senior partner for the House of NyghtFalcon. I also want to thank J.D. Malazzo, my business partner, who has been critical in the development of our film processing skills. Have a great day, and don't hesitate to contact us if you have. If you want to contact us, we can be reached at NyghtFalcon.com or our magazine site, NightVision.com. And if you want to email me directly, you can reach me at inspiration@NyghtFalcon.com.